So this is going to combine 3 videos. The first video you're going to watch has to do with right after the French and Indian War, which covers a proclamation of 1763, the Sugar and Stamp Act, the famous no taxation without representation cry, and then the Townshend Acts. So it is the official end of the French and Indian War. When we were writing down the cause and effect chart, 2 of the causes has to do with the British settlers or colonists moving out west into Native American territory. This ban forbidding the British settlers from moving out west is called the Proclamation of 1763. And they were doing it to try to protect the settlers from being attacked or killed by Native Americans. Now, the American settlers or the colonists didn't really listen to the British because the British are 3,000 miles away. What are they going to do? So they continued to move west into the Appalachian Mountains or past the Appalachian Mountains, regardless of what the British were saying. Like any war, you have to pay for it. It's expensive. So the French and Indian War had put Britain deeply in debt. And in order to pay for this debt or to pay off this debt, what does the British Prime Minister do? He raises taxes. And in order to raise taxes, he passes the Sugar and Stamp Act. The Sugar Act of 1764 places taxes on not only just sugar, but on things like coffee, indigo, and molasses. And the Stamp Act basically means that you have to get an official stamp, after of course you pay for it, on all legal documents, playing cards, newspapers, even dice. Taxation without representation. That is what the colonists were crying out. The Stamp Act and the Sugar Act were placing taxes on them, which they had to pay, but they weren't being represented in their government, which is Parliament. So Great Britain, as we know, makes up of a few different territories. It's not just England, but it's also Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. Now, the English, of course, have their parliament. The Scots were represented. The Irish eventually get represented. So do the Welsh. But where are the American colonies? So if they're not actually voting to pass these taxes, how could they be taxed? This is why you have the cry of taxation without representation. And that is still something that we actually see today. If you guys have ever noticed on the license plates from Washington, D.C., just like New Jersey says Garden State, well, Washington, D.C.'s license plates say taxation without representation. D.C. is not a state. It is a territory or a district. So they do not have any representation in Congress. So they have to pay their taxes just like we do, but they're not being represented in their government. And that is the irony of the Sugar and Stamp Act to today. After enough complaining, you have the Stamp Act Congress, in which the colonists decide that they're going to reject the Stamp Act, but they're also going to declare their loyalty to Britain. We want to stay with you. We want to stay Englishmen, English subjects, but you have to take away the Stamp Act. And they also began to assert to Parliament that if they were not represented, they had no right to tax the colonies. So they're starting to raise their voice, but at the same time, they're trying to show Great Britain that they don't want to be independent. They want to remain British subjects. They just want to have representation in their government if they're going to be taxed. And in order to demonstrate to the British Parliament that they were being serious, they began to boycott British goods. King George III, Parliament, they all want to make money. It's always about the money and it's about power, and money equals power. So when they start to lose money because the colonists are boycotting British goods, they repeal the Stamp Act. The colonists were obviously extremely happy with this victory. This would have been a cartoon that was in a newspaper where it kind of looks like a funeral procession, and they're putting the Stamp Act to rest because it has officially died. Parliament has repealed it. They have victory! The Stamp Act has been repealed, but not so fast, because in 1767, the colonists get smacked with yet another act taxing all different kinds of things. Everything from glass to paper, paint, lead, and even tea. The British favorite drink was taxed. How did the colonists react? They decide once again they're going to boycott British goods. If it worked the first time, it's definitely going to work this time. Or so they thought. Not only did the Townshend Act place taxes on things like tea and paper, but it also allowed British troops to basically search your house for smuggled goods. And instead of needing a search warrant, the only thing that they needed were the writs of assistance. So if they suspected you were, having some smuggled goods or you were involved in the black market, then they were going to go ahead and search your house without any questions. So what do people do when they're upset? They join together and they unite. Well, they united with the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. You had two separate groups because obviously the genders cannot mix. Need to keep them separated. So you had the Sons of Liberty and you had the Daughters of Liberty. And these were groups that basically organized protests against the British policies. Once again, the boycotts win. The Townshend Acts are repealed. They have to pay a tax on absolutely nothing except for tea, their favorite drink. So even though the taxes on other things like paper and glass and lead were repealed, they still have to pay a tax on tea. And that really upset the British. Congratulations, you guys have made it to the end of video 1. Make sure you're able to answer these 6 questions before moving on. Round 2, people, we are going to be covering the Quartering Act of 1765, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, and then the famous Boston Tea Party. So boycotting British goods was an effective way to get what they wanted from the British government. However, you also had other ways to protest against the British. One of them was actually writing plays that would make fun of the British. Who likes to be made fun of? No one. So this was a perfect way to irritate the British. A second way was to write pamphlets and letters that criticized Britain and get them published in newspapers and magazines and had them kind of, get around the colonies to raise people's anger and to get them involved in the war against taxes. So imagine this, if you will. You're sitting at home, you're just kind of chilling, maybe reading the newspaper, reading a book, reading the Bible. Remember, it is 1765. And all of a sudden you have a knock on the door. You have 6 British troops that want to sleep in your bed and eat your food. If you didn't let them in, you were breaking the law. The Quartering Act of 1765 mandated that the colonists had to provide candles, bedding, and beverages to British troops. When the New York Assembly heard what Britain was trying to do, they said that they were not going to follow the law. Who are you to force me to allow troops into my house? Britain responded by simply dismissing the assembly. All right, guys, you no longer exist. You have no control and no power over who obeys the laws and who don't. People are angry. They're being taxed. British troops are living in their houses. So something is going to happen. It's coming to a boiling point. And it finally spills over with the Boston Massacre. This is a very famous painting that was drawn by Patrick Henry, which we will talk about in more depth throughout the next couple of weeks. But Patrick Henry draws this, and you can see the colonists are just kind of there looking all innocent, dying, being shot at by the forceful British troops that are standing in a line with their red coat because they're not going to hide from anybody, just firing into an innocent crowd. So before this massacre took place, how did it exactly start? It started because boys were throwing snowballs at a British guard, and the guard told the little boy to stop. But just like the typical teenager, they didn't hear, or they have selective hearing. So they continued to throw snowballs at the British guards and calling them names. Eventually, a crowd starts to kind of gather around the boys, and they started to hype things up, just like you guys do. So the British troops opened fire, killing 5 people. Now, we don't know exactly who fired first or why they fired. It was basically snowballs and names that were being thrown around. The colonists didn't really have any weapons. But what we do know is that a shot gets fired. All of the British troops that were there fire, and 5 innocent people were killed, including Crispus Attucks, who was actually a black sailor that was pretty active in the Sons of Liberty. So he's considered the first martyr of the American Revolution. And this is the headstone that kind of commemorates all 5 victims of the Boston Massacre. And you can see Crispus Attucks is name number 4. Now, on the same day as the Boston Massacre, the Townshend Acts were repealed, except for, you guessed it, the tax on tea. Remember, tea is their favorite thing, kind of like coffee is mine. So it was kind of like a slap in the face. Like, yeah, we'll take away everything that you don't like, except for the one thing that you really do like, which is tea. So of course you're going to be taxed. The colonists decide to do the one thing that's kind of worked throughout all of the acts that place taxes on them. And what are they going to do? They're going to boycott the British tea. Now, as a result, of course, the companies are going to be losing a lot of money. So in 1773, the British passed the Tea Act. So before the Tea Act was in effect, you would have the British East India Company that would sell the tea to England for $5, and then England would turn around and sell the tea to the colonies for $8. You know, they're hustlers. They got to make some money. They got to make a profit. So then Britain passes the Tea Act. Now, after the Tea Act, basically what it says is that the company could sell directly to the colonies, which means instead of paying $8, they're now paying $5, the price that England would have originally paid anyways. So, why are the colonists so upset? I mean, they are getting a discounted tea price. They're upset because they were still paying the tax on tea. Even though they were getting the price discounted, it was $5 instead of $8, for example, it still included the tax. So they felt that they were being tricked into accepting the tax, like they were being bribed, like, hey, pay your taxes, you're getting it for cheaper anyway, so just pay your taxes and shut up. So they didn't like that sense of being tricked into paying for it. And they also didn't appreciate the tea merchants that had been cut out of the tea trade. So basically they had kind of fired a whole bunch of colonists because they were no longer needed. You were getting your tea directly from the British East India Company. And in order to fight this horrible Tea Act, what are you going to do? You are going to unite, fellow citizens. Join your Sons of Liberty, join your Daughters of Liberty, and let's fight this tax on tea. So we're going to fight, and we're going to party. The Boston Tea Party. You had a group of men dressed up as Native Americans that boarded 3 ships that were in the Boston Harbor, and since they weren't going to be drinking this tea because they weren't going to be paying the taxes on it, they decided they were going to throw this tea overboard into the Boston Harbor, and this is the Boston Tea Party. So before you move on to your final video, make sure you're able to answer these 5 questions. Finally, the last video, 3 topics: British response to the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, and the First Continental Congress. Now, when King George III finds out what happens, he is upset. I mean, who just throws perfectly good tea into the harbor because they didn't want to pay taxes? That's crazy. So he decides he is going to punish the people of Massachusetts by passing what is commonly known as the Intolerable Acts. So the Intolerable Acts could be broken down into 4 parts. 1, the Port of Boston is closed until all the destroyed tea is paid for. 2, you cannot meet. If you're meeting, you're definitely going to do something bad, so town meetings have been banned. 3, now instead of having trial in the colonies, you're going to be having trial back in Britain. Not fun. And then 4, in addition to the Quartering Act of the soldiers chilling at your house, they are also going to occupy unoccupied colonial buildings and homes as well. The colonists are not going to take the Intolerable Acts lying down. They are going to fight back. And the best way to fight back is to unite. So, you have delegates from 12 out of the 13 colonies that joined together in their first meeting called the First Continental Congress. During this fabulous meeting, they decided they are going to boycott all British goods. They're going to stop selling their goods to Britain until the Intolerable Acts are repealed. And here's the kicker. They urge each colony to set up its own militia, and militia are armed men. So they're kind of seeing the future, and they're trying to set up the colonies for a possible war if it comes to that. So we are officially done with this video. Make sure you're able to answer these 5 questions, complete your blog, and I will see you guys tomorrow in class.